In this gripping story, a successful black CEO becomes the target of a racist police officer, Officer Daniels, who wrongfully accuses him of a crime based solely on racial bias. The officer's discriminatory treatment and assumptions about the CEO's character highlight the deep-seated racism embedded within the system. As the protagonist fights back against these injustices, the story sheds light on how even the most powerful individuals can be subjected to racial prejudice, sparking frustration and a call for accountability. This tale serves as a stark reminder of the persistence of racism and the need for systemic change. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long, gentle shadows over the sprawling streets of downtown Winston. Despite being early, the streets were busy with people hurrying to their destinations. Among them was Jordan Riley, a man whose very presence demanded attention. Yet he seemed to do everything in his power to blend in. With his navy blue suit and polished shoes, he looked like a man accustomed to power. But his demeanor told a different story. Jordan had long ago learned how to live comfortably within his wealth and influence, but he had also learned how to move through the world quietly, never drawing attention to himself unless absolutely necessary. Jordan wasn't just any man, though he was the CEO of Riley Innovations, a multi-million-dollar tech company he had built from the ground up. His influence reached far beyond his company's headquarters, extending into boardrooms, government offices, and think tanks. But today, he wasn't walking into any of those spaces. Today, he was just a man walking down the street, blending in with the morning rush of people. To many, he was just another face in the crowd. Despite his success, Jordan had always kept a modest lifestyle. His downtown penthouse was minimalist, no extravagant decorations or opulent furniture. His wardrobe, though expensive, was purposefully understated. He didn't need to wear a suit that screamed power, because he knew his presence alone commanded respect. But it was this very humility that made Jordan seem invisible at times. It was almost as if his accomplishments, his millions, were secondary to the world's perception of who he really was. Jordan paused as he reached the corner of 5th and Broad Street, glancing across the road at the small diner where he'd been grabbing his morning coffee for the last 5 years. It wasn't much, a hole-in-the-wall spot, known for its greasy eggs and burnt toast, but it was his place. As he pushed open the door, a bell chimed above him, and the usual smell of strong coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him. "Morning, Jordan," said the waitress, Diane, without looking up from the griddle. Diane had worked here for as long as he had been coming, and she'd never made a fuss over his title. In fact, she had no idea who he really was, only that he tipped well and preferred his coffee black. Jordan smiled and nodded. "Morning, Diane." He moved toward the counter, lowering himself into one of the vinyl stools. Diane slid a coffee mug in front of him without asking, knowing full well what he wanted. He hadn't changed much in the past 5 years. Same routine, same smile, same quiet confidence. There was something comforting about the simplicity of it all. He didn't need people to know who he was. In this little diner, no one cared about Riley, Innovations, or the tech empire he ran. Here, he was just another customer. The door jingled again, and a couple entered, laughing as they talked about their plans for the weekend. A few seconds later, the diner's other regulars, an older man and a middle-aged woman, greeted each other with familiar waves and friendly nods. Jordan could see it in their eyes. They were probably wondering what he was doing in this neighborhood. A little over a year ago, Jordan had seen an old acquaintance, a high school classmate, look him up and down with disbelief when he entered this very diner. The man had muttered something under his breath about Jordan not belonging here. That people like him didn't sit in greasy spoons, not with their kind of people. It had taken Jordan by surprise, but he had let it go, choosing to ignore the man's discomfort. But it wasn't just him. Jordan had always felt that some part of the world couldn't quite process the idea of a black man like him. Wealthy, educated, powerful, existing in places where people like him were often overlooked, ignored, or even discriminated against. Whether it was at the grocery store, in a boardroom, or even in a small-town diner, there were always moments where he wasn't seen for who he truly was. This morning, as Jordan took a sip of his coffee, he noticed the subtle looks from the other customers. A glance here, a quick turn of the head there. They didn't recognize him as the CEO of Riley Innovations. They saw a man of color in an expensive suit, sitting in a low-key diner, looking ordinary. And in that moment, Jordan understood. To some people, the contrast between who he was and where he was didn't make sense. Got any plans for the weekend? Diane's voice cut through his thoughts. He looked up, offering a warm smile. No, not much. Just the usual work stuff. Diane didn't press him further, offering only a polite nod, before moving on to the other side of the counter. Jordan liked that about her. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry. It was as if he could just be, without the expectations that followed him everywhere else. But his peaceful moment was interrupted by the sudden sound of a door slamming open. A young man, maybe in his early 20s, burst into the diner, his face flushed with excitement. He made a beeline for the counter, ordering something loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Jordan barely registered the man's words until he caught a glimpse of his face, eyes darting around the room, looking over the other patrons with something like suspicion. And then his gaze fell on Jordan, his expression shifting. The young man straightened up, clearing his throat before muttering, "I'll take the usual. And, can I get some water too? You know, to go?" Jordan could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't directed at him specifically, but he recognized the undertone in the young man's behavior. The way he had hesitated, the way his gaze flicked to Jordan with a subtle wariness. It wasn't the first time he had encountered this kind of thing. A discomfort, maybe even suspicion, born from assumptions based on appearances. Jordan didn't flinch, didn't react. He'd learned long ago how to read situations like this. He took another sip of his coffee, glancing at the man again. The young man was now talking to Diane, but Jordan could see the way his eyes darted back to him every few seconds, checking to see if the other man was still watching. It was moments like this that reminded Jordan of the world he lived in, where success wasn't always enough to overcome the barriers that people of color faced. Where even the humblest moments, a simple trip to a diner, could remind him how the world saw him differently. "Here you go," Diane said, setting a water glass on the counter with a firm thud. The young man grabbed it quickly, murmuring a thank you as he turned to leave, throwing one last glance at Jordan before heading out the door. Jordan sighed, feeling the weight of the subtle judgment in the air. This wasn't new. Of course, it was the kind of thing he'd learned to navigate his entire life. But today, it felt particularly heavy. Maybe it was the way the young man had looked at him. Maybe it was the realization that no matter how far he had come, there were people who would always see him as an outsider. It was moments like this, these small and seemingly insignificant exchanges, that would eventually push Jordan toward a choice he had always believed in, fighting for what was right. But it wasn't until his identity was constantly challenged, dismissed, and reduced to assumptions that he would understand the true weight of this battle. As Jordan set down his empty coffee mug, he glanced once more around the diner. The world outside hadn't changed, but something inside him had. His resolve was firm now, as clear as the dark coffee that had fueled his morning. He wasn't just here to survive. He was here to make sure things were different, for everyone. This quiet, routine morning was the beginning of something much bigger. The conflict was brewing, and Jordan knew he'd soon have to decide how far he was willing to go to fight back against the forces that sought to hold him, and others like him, back. End of opening section. Once you're ready, we can proceed to the next part, focusing on the initial conflict and deeper character dynamics. The bell over the door jingled again, as Jordan Riley sipped his coffee, a quiet ritual that had become second nature in the past few years. He was trying to ignore the subtle undercurrent of discomfort that lingered in the diner, but it wasn't easy. His mind was already preoccupied with thoughts of work, the day ahead, and everything else. The last thing he wanted to confront was the quiet bias he felt simmering just beneath the surface. As he scanned the room, his eyes briefly met the gaze of the older man sitting across from him, a man who was clearly in his 60s, wearing an old baseball cap that looked like it had seen better days. The man's eyes were suspicious, as though trying to place Jordan, but Jordan didn't recognize him. It was an odd moment, one that would seem insignificant to anyone else, but Jordan had lived long enough to know how these small exchanges often turned into something larger. This wasn't the first time he had felt this strange sense of being watched and scrutinized. The man's eyes quickly darted away when Jordan met his gaze, and the uncomfortable silence stretched. Jordan sighed internally. It wasn't that he didn't know the world had certain expectations of him, it was just that the expectations were rarely ever clear. For some, he was just another black man in a suit, but for others, he was a token success story. Neither perspective fully recognized him for who he was or what he had built. To some people, his wealth was a puzzle that didn't quite fit the narrative of his skin color. To others, it was simply an anomaly to be ignored or mistrusted. As Jordan continued sipping his coffee, the silence around him was broken by the door opening once more. This time, it was the manager, a middle-aged man with a gruff voice and an even gruffer demeanor. He was talking to a customer, a man Jordan recognized as Mitchell Turner, the owner of a local convenience store just a few blocks away. The two were exchanging pleasantries, but Jordan didn't miss the way the manager's tone shifted when he glanced at him. "Oh, I see you're getting your coffee from Mr. Riley," the manager said to Mitchell, his voice a little too loud. "Not many folks here can afford that kind of habit, huh?" The comment hung in the air, a casual but unmistakable remark that tugged at something inside Jordan. He clenched his jaw, controlling his breath, but it wasn't enough to calm the sting that settled into his chest. He wasn't surprised by it. In fact, Jordan had experienced worse, plenty of times before. But there was something about the nonchalance in the manager's voice that made it sting just a little more. Jordan had always known how to navigate these moments. He had learned the hard way to keep his emotions in check, never letting anyone see how the comments, the assumptions, or the blatant prejudice affected him. He had built his entire career around being underestimated and proving people wrong. Yet, here in this diner, his quiet escape, he realized that the cost of this constant battle was starting to weigh on him more than it had before. Instead of responding, Jordan simply smiled. He didn't let his discomfort show, instead adopting the calm mask he had worn so many times before. "Don't mind me," he said lightly, lifting his coffee cup to his lips as if nothing had happened. Mitchell, oblivious to the underlying tension, grinned back. "I always figured you had expensive taste, Mr. Riley. No harm in that, right?" The words, though polite on the surface, did nothing to soothe the tension that had begun to rise between the two men. The manager looked at Jordan once more, and Jordan noticed the faint skepticism in his eyes. It wasn't as if the man had made a major show of his prejudice. It wasn't about any overt displays of hate. It was the subtle dismissals, the offhand comments, and the way his presence was just othered. And yet, somehow, Jordan had always known that his wealth and success didn't erase the reality of how he was seen. It was in moments like these, quiet and almost invisible, where the true injustice lay. And yet, Jordan wasn't sure how to confront it. Not in a place like this, not when the stakes were small, when there was nothing to gain by standing up except a deeper sense of alienation. "Right," Jordan said, nodding slightly. "Expensive taste." Jordan's focus shifted, and he noticed a couple entering the diner, two white women in their late 20s, laughing as they took their seats at a nearby booth. They were oblivious to the quiet discomfort in the air, to the way the rest of the diner had shifted slightly in its focus, now observing the exchange between Jordan and the manager. But Jordan had learned to read such things, he could feel it in the stillness of the room. The manager shuffled over to take their order, while Jordan turned his attention back to his coffee, allowing the sounds of the diner to flood his senses. The clink of silverware, the murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. It all blended together, a familiar symphony of normalcy that offered him some solace. For a moment, it was as if the world outside didn't matter. Just him, his coffee, and his space in the world. But then, as if on cue, Officer Daniels entered the diner. Jordan froze for a moment, the atmosphere in the room shifting instantly as the officer walked through the door, his uniform sharp and his face set in a stern expression. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the unmistakable air of authority that came with the badge. Officer Daniels had a reputation in town, one that wasn't exactly sterling. Jordan had heard stories about his actions over the years, some of them whispered, some of them loud and angry. But Jordan had always kept his distance from these rumors. Daniels wasn't here for him, though Jordan could tell as soon as the officer's eyes scanned the room and briefly landed on him. But there was something in the way Daniels looked at him, a flicker of discomfort that Jordan had come to recognize. It wasn't overt, but it was enough for him to feel it in his bones. Without greeting anyone, Officer Daniels made his way to the counter. Diane nodded to him with the same politeness she gave everyone else. Jordan watched quietly, his thoughts shifting back to the weight of the officer's presence. He couldn't help but wonder if Daniels was judging him as well, perhaps the same way the manager had. Was it just the badge, or did it have something to do with his skin color? Jordan couldn't be sure. "Coffee black," Daniels said curtly. As he waited for his order, he glanced over at Jordan once more. This time, it wasn't subtle. Jordan met his gaze, holding it for a moment, before looking away. Daniels had lingered, though, almost imperceptibly longer than necessary. Jordan wasn't sure why he felt so unsettled by this moment, but he did. The air seemed to thicken, and Jordan knew that he had to leave. He didn't need to stay here any longer. It was becoming clear that the small interactions that filled his day weren't small at all. They were the cracks in the foundation of how people perceived him and how the system treated him. He was an anomaly, a successful black man who had made his way into spaces that hadn't been designed for people like him. But no matter what accomplishments he achieved, no matter how much power he gained, there would always be those who saw him only for his skin, only for the stereotypes they carried about who he was supposed to be. As Jordan rose to leave, he paid Diane, his usual tip placed on the counter as he gave her a tight smile. He didn't look at Officer Daniels again. But the moment lingered. In a town that saw so much of what he had accomplished, Jordan understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that no matter how high he rose, some people would always find a way to look down on him. That thought stayed with him as he walked out the door, the bell jingling faintly in his wake. The world outside was bustling, but Jordan's mind was elsewhere, wrestling with what had just transpired, what he had experienced, and what lay ahead. He was a man with the power to effect change. But as he continued to step into the world each day, he realized that the real battle wasn't just about his rise. It was about the forces working quietly against him, and how much longer he could continue to navigate them without confronting them head-on. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a brilliant glare over the small town of Greenville, but for Jordan Riley, the warmth outside didn't match the chill in his chest. The morning had started as any other, uneventful, familiar, comfortable even. Yet, in the span of a few minutes, his entire sense of peace was shattered. As he walked past the storefronts on Main Street, his mind racing with thoughts of upcoming business deals, he noticed a commotion just ahead. A group of people had gathered in front of the local convenience store. He could see Officer Daniels among them, his broad form towering over the small crowd. The officer's hands were clasped firmly behind his back, his face twisted into a scowl as he engaged with the manager. But it wasn't the officer's presence that made Jordan pause. It was the unmistakable feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. Jordan's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his assistant, reminding him of an important meeting later that afternoon. He shoved the phone back in his pocket, but a sense of urgency tugged at his gut. Something didn't feel right. The tension in the air felt thick, and Jordan couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. As he moved closer, his stomach dropped. He recognized the woman standing at the center of the commotion. Mitchell Turner's wife, Lisa Jordan, had known Mitchell for years, and Lisa had always struck him as kind-hearted and warm. But today, she looked frazzled, a tear streaking down her face, her hands wringing nervously as Officer Daniels spoke to her in a low, gruff voice. Before Jordan could make sense of the situation, Officer Daniels turned sharply and caught sight of him approaching. The officer's eyes narrowed, and Jordan's heart rate quickened. He felt the weight of Daniels' gaze settle on him like a physical blow. Jordan took a deep breath, maintaining a calm composure. His reputation, his hard-earned success, and his identity as a black man in this small town had always been complex. Today, however, it was about to become even more so. "Riley," Officer Daniels greeted him, his voice cold but laced with something else. Disdain, perhaps, or a slight smirk he was trying to hide. "Can I help you with something?" Jordan forced himself to keep his voice steady. "I was just passing by. What's going on here?" The officer's eyes flicked between him and Lisa. "This woman's been making a scene, accused of stealing from the store," Daniels replied dismissively. "I'm sure you know how it goes." Lisa's eyes widened in shock, her voice trembling as she tried to speak. I haven't stolen anything, Officer Daniels. This is a mistake." Daniels cut her off, his tone rising. "You match the description, ma'am, that's enough for me." He paused and shot a glance at Jordan, his words dripping with barely concealed disdain. "People like you should know better than to get caught up in things like this. Can't say I'm surprised." Jordan's blood boiled, but he fought to keep his emotions in check. He had seen this play out far too many times before. An innocent person being railroaded simply because they didn't fit the image of respectability that certain people expected of them. "Officer Daniels," Jordan said, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of authority, "I know Lisa. She's a respected member of this community, and she's certainly not involved in anything like this." The officer didn't even look at him as he answered. "Doesn't matter who she is," Daniels muttered. "A suspect is a suspect." Jordan felt a flare of frustration in his chest, but he didn't let it show. His gaze flicked over to Mitchell Turner, who was standing near the crowd but had yet to step forward. Mitchell was staring at Lisa, his face tight with concern, but lacking the urgency Jordan felt in his gut. Was he afraid? Or was it something else? Before Jordan could say anything else, Officer Daniels made a sharp gesture, and another officer arrived, a younger man who seemed more bewildered than anything else. "Grayson," Daniels barked, his voice commanding, "get this woman in the car, we're taking her in for questioning." Grayson, looking unsure of himself, hesitated for a moment, glancing from Lisa to the bystanders who were starting to whisper. Jordan noticed the way his eyes flickered toward him, perhaps sensing some unspoken tension in the air. "You can't be serious," Jordan said, stepping forward and standing between the officer and Lisa. "There's no reason to arrest her, she hasn't done anything wrong." His voice was firm, but it was clear that Daniels wasn't going to be swayed. Daniels looked at Jordan for the first time, his eyes cold and calculating. "I'll handle this, Riley," he said, his voice low. "It's none of your business." Jordan stood his ground, the urge to do something, to step into action, burning in his chest. "You're wrong, Daniels. This is my business. I'm not going to let you treat someone this way, not in front of me, not in front of everyone here." The crowd had started to gather, their murmurs louder now, the tension palpable. But there was something off about their presence. No one was stepping forward to stop Daniels. They were all spectators, too afraid to get involved, too conditioned to stay out of it. Jordan could see that Lisa's face had gone pale, the weight of her helplessness sinking into her shoulders. He felt that same helplessness rise up in him, and he knew then that he couldn't let this go on. "You know what this is, don't you, Daniels?" Jordan said, his voice hardening. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that people talk about in whispers, the kind of injustice that gets swept under the rug, day after day, but I'm not letting you get away with it." Daniels's face twisted in annoyance, and he took a step closer. "You're making a mistake, Riley. Stay out of it, or I'll make it your problem." In that moment, the room seemed to freeze. The crowd fell silent, and Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. He had always managed to stay above the fray, always kept his cool, and never let his anger cloud his better judgment. But now, with everything on the line, he wasn't going to back down. Jordan took a slow step forward, his posture rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. "No, you're the one making a mistake, and I'm not walking away from this." The young officer, Grayson, shifted awkwardly, looking back and forth between Jordan and Daniels, his expression torn. He could see where this was headed, and for the first time, it seemed as though Officer Daniels was starting to lose his cool. "You think you can intimidate me?" Daniels sneered. "You think your money and your status give you the right to talk down to me? You've got another thing coming." Jordan felt his breath catch in his throat. He had seen this before, how power, no matter how misplaced, could breed arrogance, how people like Daniels hid behind their badge, thinking it made them untouchable. But this wasn't just about power. This was about human decency. The crowd was watching now, the air thick with anticipation, and Jordan's resolve solidified. He turned to Grayson. "You don't have to follow him, you know. You can do what's right. You don't have to be complicit." Grayson hesitated, his eyes darting nervously from Daniels to Jordan. Jordan could see the internal battle in his eyes. He wasn't fully convinced that what Daniels was doing was justified. But he didn't have the strength to stand up just yet. Jordan understood that. But this moment, right here, could be pivotal. It could be the catalyst for something bigger. Officer Daniels took a step toward Lisa, grabbing her arm roughly, but before he could drag her away, Jordan stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "I won't let you do this," he said, his voice low but powerful. Daniel's lips curled into a snarl. "Move now." Jordan didn't budge. His pulse raced, but his mind was sharp. He could feel his body tense, ready for anything. The whole town was watching: Lisa, Mitchell, Grayson, and the crowd. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Would Jordan back down? Or would he fight? The tension had reached a breaking point. It was now, or never. And Jordan, despite the fear that simmered in his gut, knew that this was just the beginning. The crowd grew still, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, and the world around Jordan Riley seemed to narrow down to just him, Officer Daniels, and Lisa. The small town street, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a battleground. Jordan's heart beat loudly in his chest. Officer Daniels's hand was still wrapped around Lisa's arm, dragging her toward the police car, but the officer's attention was now fully on him. There was a shift in the air, something that felt like the calm before a storm. "Let her go," Jordan's voice rang out, clear and firm. He knew the power of his presence in this moment. He knew how his wealth and status could command attention. But this time, it wasn't about any of that. This was about doing the right thing. Officer Daniels glared at him, the lines of his face hardened with contempt. "You don't tell me what to do, Riley," he sneered. "You think you're above the law because you're some rich businessman. This is my town, my street, and I'll handle it as I see fit." The disdain in Daniels' voice was unmistakable, but it only fueled Jordan's resolve. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, a mix of anger and determination boiling inside him. He had worked hard for everything he had in life. He had spent decades building a career, making sacrifices, earning respect. But none of that mattered now, not when a woman, an innocent woman, was being treated like a criminal simply because of her skin color. Jordan took a step closer, matching Daniels's glare with one of his own. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. "But I know exactly what you're doing, and I won't stand by and let you destroy someone's life because of your biases." Daniel's hand tightened on Lisa's arm, and he took a step forward, clearly trying to assert control. "You think you can intimidate me? You think your money and connections can change the facts? This woman's got a record, and she matched the description. That's all I need." Jordan's eyes flicked to Lisa's tear-streaked face, the helplessness in her eyes. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew that standing here, right now, was more than just a confrontation. It was a fight for justice. It was a battle against the systemic biases that had plagued this town for years. "I don't care what you think you know, Daniels," Jordan said, his voice rising with a newfound confidence. "You're not going to get away with this, not today, not ever." Daniels scoffed, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. "You really think you can change anything? You're just a businessman, Riley. This is the real world, get used to it." Jordan's mind raced. This wasn't just about standing up for Lisa. This was about making sure that no one else would have to go through this. No one else would have to suffer under the weight of officers like Daniels, whose bigotry was allowed to fester unchecked. Mitchell Turner, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, watching in silence, stepped forward now. He hesitated, then caught Jordan's eye. "Jordan, I don't know what to do, man. I want to help, but you're going up against the system Daniels has been with the department for years." Jordan's gaze softened as he turned to Mitchell. He understood Mitchell's hesitance. The system had made people like him, people who were afraid of rocking the boat, but Jordan couldn't back down. Not now. "I know it's hard, Mitch, but that's exactly why we have to fight. If we don't, if we let this slide, it'll just keep happening. It's time for change." Mitchell looked torn, but Jordan could see the determination flicker in his eyes. "You're right, let's do it." Jordan nodded, then turned back to Officer Daniels, who was still gripping Lisa's arm. "I'm not asking anymore," Jordan said, his voice steady and unwavering. "Release her." For a brief moment, Daniels hesitated. The officer looked from Lisa to Jordan, a flash of something like doubt crossing his face. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same hardened resolve. "I said no," Daniels spat, his voice venomous. Before Jordan could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What the hell is going on here?" The crowd parted as another officer, a woman, strode through. Her uniform was pristine, her expression no nonsense. She was tall and commanding, with a presence that demanded respect. Jordan immediately recognized her as Lieutenant Harris, the head of the local police department. She had a reputation for being fair, but tough, and Jordan knew that she could either be an ally or another obstacle in this fight. Daniel's face twisted into a mask of frustration. "Lieutenant, this man is interfering with an ongoing investigation." Harris's eyes narrowed, her gaze flicking over the scene with a practiced eye. She took in Lisa, still trembling, and then turned to Jordan. "What's going on here, Riley?" Jordan met her gaze with determination. "This is a wrongful arrest. Lisa Turner has been accused of a crime she didn't commit. Officer Daniels is acting on nothing more than a description, one that doesn't even match Lisa." Harris glanced briefly at Daniels, then back to Jordan. "Is that so?" Daniels shot her a look, but the lieutenant held her ground. "What exactly happened, Riley?" Jordan explained quickly, leaving out nothing. He told her about Lisa's character, her contributions to the community, and how she was being treated unfairly because of her race. He didn't sugarcoat the truth. He didn't have time for that. The stakes were too high. When he finished, Harris looked at Lisa, then back at Daniels. The silence stretched long, and Jordan could feel the weight of every second. Would she side with Daniels, or would she do what was right? Finally, Harris spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Daniels, I want you to release her now. I'll take over this investigation." Daniels' eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't argue. He knew better than to cross the lieutenant. He released Lisa's arm roughly, sending her stumbling toward Jordan. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, but relief flooded over her face as she realized she was free. Jordan stepped forward, wrapping his arm around her shoulders in support. "Thank you," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "Thank you so much." Jordan nodded, his heart still racing. He turned to Lieutenant Harris, who stood with her arms crossed, watching them with an unreadable expression. "You'll be investigating this further?" Jordan asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "Making sure this doesn't happen again?" Harris met his gaze evenly. "I will," she said, her tone measured. "We'll review everything, you have my word." Jordan wasn't sure whether he believed her, but for now, it was a small victory. He glanced at Mitchell, who gave him a tentative nod, and then back to Lisa. She was safe, at least for the moment, but Jordan knew the fight wasn't over. This wasn't just about her, it was about the larger system that had failed her, and so many others. As the crowd began to disperse, Jordan's mind started racing again. The police department had a deep systemic problem, and it wasn't just Officer Daniels, it was everything. The way they were trained, the way they treated people of color, the lack of accountability. Jordan knew that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. But for now, he had one thing that mattered. A small victory, and the determination to push further. He had the resolve to make sure that this was the beginning of something bigger. Before he could speak to Lisa again, Officer Grayson approached him, his expression hesitant. "Riley," he began quietly, "I just wanted to apologize. I should have done more. I should have stepped in sooner." Jordan looked at him, the younger officer's words weighing heavily in the air. There was a sincerity there, but it was too soon to tell if it would lead to anything. "Words are easy," Jordan replied. "It's actions that count." Grayson nodded, his eyes sincere. "I'll do what I can, I'm going to help." Jordan looked over at Lisa, who had her arms around herself, still shaken. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time that day, he felt a flicker of hope. Change was possible, but it would take more than just words. It would take real action, and Jordan was ready to lead the charge. The tension in the air felt suffocating as Jordan stood face to face with Officer Daniels, the man whose actions had pushed him to this point. The crowd that had gathered had thinned out, but the weight of the moment still hung heavily over the scene. Daniels was standing across from Jordan, his posture rigid, his eyes full of anger. But it was the look of disbelief in his eyes that Jordan knew would be the key to unraveling this whole charade. You really think you can come in here and demand that I let her go? Daniels scoffed, his voice full of contempt. You think because you're some big shot in this town, with all your money and power, that you can push me around? You think I'm scared of you? Jordan clenched his jaw. He could feel the fire burning in his chest, a mixture of anger and frustration at the way Daniels had dismissed his every plea, at how he had treated Lisa like she was nothing more than a criminal because of her race. The audacity of the man stood in front of him was more than Jordan could handle. No, Daniels, Jordan said, his voice low but steady. I think you're scared of what happens when the truth comes out, and I think you know exactly what you've done. Daniels took a step forward, his chest puffing out with arrogance. You don't know anything about me, Riley. You're just another privileged man thinking the world revolves around you. The law is the law, and I'm doing my job. She's guilty, that's all there is to it. Jordan's eyes narrowed. Your job, huh? Your job is to protect and serve, isn't it? Not to abuse your power because you don't like the way someone looks, and as for guilt, she's innocent, Daniels, and you're about to find out how much trouble you're in. The air crackled with the heat of the confrontation. People were beginning to gather once again, murmurs of the scene spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Jordan could feel the eyes of the bystanders on him. Some were still hesitant, some supportive, but all were waiting for something to break. I don't care who you think you are, Daniels spat. This is my town, my street. You don't get to tell me what to do. He reached for his radio, clearly intending to escalate the situation further. Jordan's heart raced. He couldn't let this go any further, not when he knew he had the leverage to take this fight straight to the heart of the corruption. But before Daniels could make the call, Jordan stepped forward with intent, blocking his path. The crowd grew quiet, the energy in the air shifting. The tension was now palpable, as though the very fabric of justice itself hung in the balance. Let's talk about that, Jordan said, his voice cold and calculated. Let's talk about your history, Daniels. About your patterns, about the people you've hurt, the lives you've ruined, all while wearing that badge. Daniels faltered. There was a flicker in his eyes, a brief flash of unease, but it was quickly masked by his trademark smugness. You don't know what you're talking about, Riley. I've been doing this for years, and no one's ever questioned me. You think you can just waltz in here and change that? I don't think I can, Jordan said, his voice now firm, unwavering. But I do know something. I know that you have a history, and it's about to be exposed. You've gotten away with it for too long, hiding behind the badge, pretending like your actions don't have consequences. Daniel's hand dropped from his radio. He was still trying to mask his discomfort, but Jordan saw it now, the vulnerability behind the cocky exterior. Jordan had hit a nerve. What the hell are you talking about? Daniels demanded, his voice rising with defensive anger. Jordan took a slow breath. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him now, waiting for the moment where the truth would come crashing through. I'm talking about the complaints filed against you, the history of excessive force, of racial profiling. All of it. It's all in the records, and I've seen it. Daniel's face flushed with anger, his eyes wild. You can't prove any of that. It's just hearsay. Just talk from people who don't know anything about real policing. Jordan stood tall, his back straight, his resolve hardening. You think people don't notice? You think your actions, your corruption, have been invisible? I've got the evidence, Daniel's video footage, witness testimonies, it's all there, and I'm not going to stop until it's out in the open. The crowd had been silent up until now, but whispers began to ripple through it. Some murmured in agreement with Jordan, others exchanged looks of concern. Officer Daniels, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. His eyes darted to the people around him, but there was no escaping the truth. It was too late to cover up now. You can't do this, Daniel snarled, stepping closer, his body towering over Jordan. You don't know what you're messing with. I'll make sure you regret this. But Jordan didn't back down. His stance was unyielding. He knew that everything he had worked for, his reputation, his wealth, his position, meant nothing in this moment. He was fighting for something far more important. The truth, justice, and the safety of those who had been targeted for far too long by people like Daniels. I've already made my decision, Jordan said, locking eyes with Daniels. And you're going to be held accountable for what you've done. In that moment, the weight of what was happening hit Jordan all at once. The stakes were no longer just about Lisa's wrongful arrest. They were about exposing a deep-rooted systemic issue that affected countless lives. He wasn't just fighting for one person anymore. He was fighting for an entire community that had been silenced for too long. Daniels recoiled slightly, the realization dawning on him. "You can't win this fight," he said through gritted teeth, his voice tinged with desperation. "The system is behind me. You're nothing but a nuisance." Jordan didn't flinch. "Not anymore," he replied quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made Daniels hesitate for the first time. "The system is broken, and it's time for people like you to be exposed for the frauds you are." At that moment, Lieutenant Harris arrived, her presence commanding. She had seen enough. She had watched Daniels' behavior closely, and now she knew what had been happening in her own department. Her decision had already been made. She was no longer going to look the other way. "Enough," Harris said, her voice firm as she approached the two men. "Daniels, I'm placing you on administrative leave effective immediately. We'll be conducting an internal investigation into your actions." Daniels's face twisted with disbelief, but Harris wasn't finished. "I don't know how long you thought you could keep this up, but this stops today. You're done." Jordan's heart raced with the knowledge that the tides were finally turning, but even as the confrontation between him and Daniels seemed to reach its peak, the weight of the moment lingered. This was just one battle in a much larger war against corruption, prejudice, and injustice. Daniels didn't say anything else. His face was a mask of frustration as Harris led him away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. But even as he was escorted out of the scene, Jordan knew the victory was not yet complete. There was still more work to do. As the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of approval spread like wildfire. Jordan turned to Lisa, who had watched the entire confrontation unfold with wide eyes, her body still trembling. But now there was a flicker of hope in her gaze. "We did it," Jordan said, his voice soft but full of conviction. "But this isn't over. We've only just begun." Lisa nodded, her hands still shaking, but there was a sense of determination in her eyes now. "Thank you, Jordan. For everything." Jordan gave her a reassuring smile. "We're just getting started." As they walked away from the scene, the weight of the battle they had fought hung heavy in the air. But there was a spark of hope now. A hope that things could change, that the fight wasn't in vain. But as Jordan prepared for the next stage of the battle, the knowledge that this was just the beginning filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. The stakes were higher than ever before, but he was ready to face whatever came next. Jordan stood in front of Officer Daniels, his heart pounding in his chest, every muscle in his body taut with anticipation. The heat of the moment made the air feel thick, oppressive, and Jordan could sense that this was it. The confrontation that had been building up for weeks, a turning point that could either break him or ignite a larger movement for justice. Behind him, Lisa stood close, her breath quick, but Jordan kept his focus on Daniels. The officer's face was red with anger, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. For the first time in their encounters, Daniels wasn't acting so certain of his authority. His posture was aggressive, his arms crossed, and his feet planted firmly, but Jordan could see the vulnerability beneath the hardened facade. He was cornered, and Jordan could feel it. "You don't get it, Riley," Daniels spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can come in here, throw your weight around, and suddenly the world changes. I've been doing this for years. You think I'm just gonna let you walk all over me because you're some rich guy with a fancy title?" His voice grew louder, more belligerent with every word. Jordan took a deep breath, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the fury bubbling just beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was the moment he had prepared for, the moment when everything he had worked for, everything he had fought for, was about to come to light. "No, Daniels," Jordan said, his voice steady, his words deliberate. "I don't think I'm walking over you. I think you've been walking all over the law, and I'm here to stop it. I'm not here because of my title. I'm here because I'm sick of watching people like Lisa and so many others get mistreated by someone like you." Daniels scoffed, but Jordan could see the flicker of panic in his eyes. He had underestimated Jordan's resolve. That much was clear. Daniels had assumed that because Jordan was wealthy, because he was powerful, that he would back down, that his name alone could carry him through. But Jordan wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for something much bigger than his own success. He was fighting for justice. "You're just another entitled man, Riley," Daniels growled. "What do you even know about real life, about the streets? The way it really is? You think this is just some little misunderstanding. You don't understand the pressure we face, the things we have to deal with every day. I'm trying to keep the peace, and people like you think you can tell me how to do my job." Jordan's eyes narrowed, his breath coming a little faster now. The words Daniels was saying were starting to reveal the cracks in his armor. It wasn't about keeping the peace, it was about control, power, and keeping people like Lisa down. The truth was staring Jordan right in the face. Daniels wasn't just a corrupt officer, he was a man who believed the system existed to protect him, and anyone who challenged that system was an enemy, a threat. "No," Jordan said, taking a step closer. "I understand perfectly. You've been given a badge, a gun, and the power to enforce laws, but all you've done is use that power to hurt people who don't have a voice. You've been doing this for years, haven't you? Hurting people just like Lisa, throwing them away because they don't matter to you, but that ends now." Daniel's face twisted with rage. "You don't get to lecture me, Riley," he spat, his hands balling into fists. "You think you're some savior? You think the world's going to change because you tell the truth? You don't know what it's like to stand in my shoes, to have to deal with all the people who don't appreciate the job we're doing. You don't know anything about the real world." Jordan stood tall, unwavering. The fire inside him was fierce, but he kept it contained, letting his words, his voice, carry the weight of his determination. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down. "I do know the real world," Jordan said, his tone quiet but firm. "And I know what it's like to be afraid, to be judged before you even get a chance. I know what it's like to be overlooked, dismissed, mistreated because of the color of your skin, the job you do, or the family you come from. But I'm not here to lecture you, Daniels. I'm here to make sure that people like Lisa don't have to live in fear anymore. And if that means I have to take you down to make it happen, then I will." Daniel's eyes flickered with something close to fear. Jordan could see it now. The cracks in his arrogance, the fear of exposure. This wasn't just about Lisa anymore. This was about Daniel's entire career, his power, his ability to get away with whatever he wanted. He had been used to getting away with things, but now someone was calling him out. And he didn't know how to respond. "You think you can just come in here, walk into my world, and change everything? You're nothing, Riley. Just a rich guy who thinks he can fix things. You think that's gonna make me stop?" Daniels sneered, stepping forward. "You don't scare me. You've got nothing on me." But Jordan wasn't backing down. He had the proof, the video footage, and the testimony. He had everything they needed to expose Daniels, and he was ready to fight for it, no matter the cost. His mind raced as he strategized, thinking of all the angles he couldn't afford to let this go. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "I don't need to scare you, Daniels," Jordan said, voice steady and sure. "I have the evidence, and I'll make sure everyone knows what you've been doing. You've hurt enough people. But today, I'm stopping you." For a split second, Daniels looked like he might back down. Then, the look in his eyes hardened again. The desperation, the need to protect himself was clear. And in that moment, Jordan knew. This wouldn't be easy. But it was his fight now. His responsibility. "You think you're so clever," Daniels said, his voice dangerously low. "But I've been in this game longer than you. You can't take me down. You're not the first person who's tried." Jordan felt his chest tighten. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Daniels. This was it. There was no turning back. "I don't need to be the first, Daniels," Jordan said softly. "But I am the last." The silence stretched between them, thick and tense, before Daniels made a sudden move, grabbing for his radio. The sharp click of the button echoed through the space. His face was a mixture of rage and fear now, but Jordan didn't flinch. "Don't do it," Jordan warned, his voice steady as a rock. "You're done, you're finished." But Daniels didn't listen. His hand was already halfway to the radio when he froze, realizing too late that Jordan wasn't bluffing. The crowd, sensing the danger, had begun to move away, some even recording the confrontation on their phones. But Jordan kept his focus, his heart pounding in his chest as the moment stretched on. And then, the unexpected happened. Lieutenant Harris, the one officer who had begun to realize the depths of Daniel's corruption, stepped forward. Her expression was stern, no longer full of the doubt and hesitation that had once marked her responses. "Enough, Daniels," Harris commanded, her voice cutting through the tension. "You're done. I'm placing you on administrative leave until we can investigate your actions fully." Daniels turned, his face an ugly mask of disbelief, then anger, then finally, defeat. "What you? This is ridiculous. You can't just do that." But Harris didn't hesitate. "I can, and I will. I've seen enough. You've crossed the line one too many times." As Daniels was led away, his face red with rage, Jordan exhaled slowly. The first victory had been won, but the war was far from over. This was just the beginning of a larger fight, one that would take everything Jordan had. But he was ready. The truth was out. And now, it was time for the system to change. Lisa stood by his side, her eyes wide with relief, but there was a new understanding between them now. This wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about something much bigger. This was about justice. But as the scene began to wind down, the weight of the moment still hung in the air. Jordan knew that Daniels wasn't the only one who had to be held accountable. And as he looked around, he realized that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. The stakes had never been higher. Jordan's hands shook slightly as he watched Officer Daniels being escorted away. The air felt thick, and the sounds around him seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. His victory had been hard won, and though Daniels was on his way out, Jordan knew this was only the first step. The real battle had just begun. Lisa, standing beside him, was visibly relieved but cautious. She had suffered so much under Daniel's unjust treatment, and now that her tormentor was being held accountable, it was hard to believe it was really happening. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jordan nodded slowly, though his heart was still racing. "This part, yes, but there's more. We have to make sure Daniels doesn't just walk away. We need to make sure the system he represents is held accountable." Lisa nodded, her hands wringing together, the reality of the moment settling in. It had been a long, painful journey, and the promise of justice was starting to feel like a distant light at the end of a very long tunnel. The following weeks brought more change than Jordan had anticipated. His decision to stand up against Daniel's blatant racism had sparked more than just his personal victory. It had created ripples through the system that could no longer be ignored. Jordan was no longer just an outsider challenging corruption, he was a symbol of resilience. The press had caught wind of the events at the police station, and his name was becoming well known, especially among activist groups fighting for racial justice. The video footage he had secured, showing Daniel's unjust arrest and his history of misconduct, was now public, and it was impossible for the authorities to keep it hidden. Internal Affairs had launched a thorough investigation into Daniel's actions, and more witnesses had come forward, supporting Jordan's claims of systemic abuse and prejudice. Daniels, once a man who wielded his badge like a shield, was now fighting to hold on to his career. His previous arrogance was replaced by frantic desperation as his past misdeeds were exposed. His credibility, once invincible, was now shattered. The community rallied behind Jordan's call for reform, with protesters organizing peaceful demonstrations in support of a more equitable justice system. Jordan watched as the tides began to turn. Where there had once been fear, there was now a growing courage in the people he had fought for, the underrepresented, the overlooked, and the forgotten. In every conversation, in every interview, Jordan was adamant. This wasn't just about exposing one officer's corruption. It was about changing a system that allowed men like Daniels to operate unchecked for so long. One evening, after another long day of meetings and strategizing with community leaders and lawyers, Jordan sat in his office overlooking the city skyline, reflecting on everything that had happened. His phone buzzed on the desk, a reminder of the many things still left to do. He was far from finished. He thought back to his first confrontation with Officer Daniels, when the tension had been unbearable, and yet he had stood firm. He had learned so much from the ordeal, about patience, persistence, and the power of a single voice. But he also understood how easy it could have been to lose himself in anger. The system was rigged, and the stakes were incredibly high. His victory over Daniels wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a movement that would, hopefully, continue long after he was gone. Jordan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his office door opening. Lisa stepped in, a look of relief and hope on her face. "You're doing it, Jordan," she said, her voice full of quiet admiration. "I see it in their eyes. People are starting to listen." Jordan smiled faintly, but the weight of everything still lingered in his chest. "There's still so much work to do. This is just the first step. The system runs deeper than one bad cop. We've got to fix this at every level." Lisa nodded, stepping closer to the desk. "I know. But look at what we've done so far. We've opened their eyes. We've given people hope." Jordan stood at the front of the community meeting the following week, his voice filled with a steady determination. The room was packed, people from all walks of life, united by a shared belief in the need for reform. Activists, local leaders, and even some former law enforcement officers were there, all working together to push for changes within the police force. "I know what it's like to stand alone, to feel like no one is listening," Jordan said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "But I'm here to tell you that we are stronger than the systems built to keep us down. We've seen what happens when we let one bad actor slip through the cracks, but we've also seen what happens when we come together. We force change." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jordan could feel the energy in the room shift. For the first time in a long time, people were truly believing that change was possible. Lisa stood by his side, a quiet smile on her face as she watched him address the crowd. She had come to respect Jordan, not just for his wealth or his power, but for his unwavering sense of right and wrong. He wasn't the man he had been when they first met. He had become something more, something greater. He had become a leader. As the investigation into Officer Daniels continued, new revelations emerged. A pattern of racial profiling, excessive force, and manipulation of evidence was uncovered. Daniels had been involved in multiple instances of misconduct, but his past behavior had been swept under the rug by the police department for years. Now, with Jordan leading the charge, the walls of silence were finally coming down. Internal Affairs, once reluctant to get involved, was now taking swift action. Daniels was arrested, charged with multiple offenses, and was facing the possibility of prison time. His actions had not only jeopardized his career, but had also cast a shadow over the reputation of the department. The ripple effects of his actions had spread far beyond the individual cases he had handled. They had now shaken the very foundation of the community's trust in its law enforcement. But as the police department began to address the issue, Jordan knew this wasn't enough. Accountability for one officer would not solve the deeper issues within the system. It was only the beginning of a much larger conversation about systemic racism, inequality, and the ways in which power could be abused without consequence. Jordan's role in this conversation was far from over. Jordan's success had brought him into the spotlight, and with that came the pressure to continue pushing for reform. He began speaking at national conferences, lending his voice to the growing movement for police accountability. His work, however, was not without its challenges. Every victory seemed to spark new resistance from those who were invested in maintaining the status quo. The fight for justice was not an easy one, and Jordan knew that each victory came with a cost. But he was prepared to pay it. "Progress takes time," Jordan said in one interview, his tone resolute. "But if we stop fighting, if we stop pushing for accountability, then we are complicit. This fight is not just mine, it's all of ours." In the weeks following the resolution of Daniels' case, Jordan watched as the system began to change. New policies were implemented, new training programs introduced, and a series of community oversight committees were formed to ensure that the department would be held accountable. Change was slow, but it was happening. Lisa, always by his side, had become a strong advocate for continued reform, and they began working together with other activists to push for larger, nationwide changes. They knew that this was just the beginning, but they also knew they had already made a lasting impact. As Jordan looked at the progress they had made, he knew it wasn't just about one officer being exposed. It was about the conversations that had started, the awareness that had been raised, and the inspiration he had helped provide to others. His resilience, his determination, and his willingness to stand against the tide had ignited a movement, and that movement would continue long after he was gone. The road ahead would be long, and there would be many battles to fight. But for the first time, Jordan felt confident that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city, Jordan stood at the window of his office, looking out at the horizon. The fight wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. He had done what he set out to do, but there was still so much more to come. Jordan stood at the window, the skyline of the city stretching out before him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of the past few weeks beginning to lift. The storm that had raged within him, fueled by injustice, anger, and a burning desire to make things right, was slowly but surely starting to subside. It had been a long, exhausting battle, and yet, he knew this moment wasn't an end. It was just a new beginning. Throughout this ordeal, Jordan had been tested in ways he hadn't imagined possible. He had faced an immense amount of resistance, both from within the system and from people who were comfortable with the way things had always been. He had fought against systemic racism, the abuse of power, and the unspoken rules that allowed corrupt officers like Daniels to thrive unchecked. But through it all, Jordan had remained resolute. At the start of this journey, Jordan was a man driven by a sense of duty. He had built his career and reputation on the principle of fairness, hard work, and integrity. But the events surrounding Officer Daniels had stripped him of his naive belief that everything was fair in this world. The experience had changed him, hardened him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had learned how deeply ingrained systemic racism was, and how the system was designed to protect those in power, even when they abused it. But Jordan had also learned that no one was truly powerless, no matter how stacked the odds were. From the very first moment he had witnessed Daniels's mistreatment of Lisa, he had been propelled into action. It was no longer about a single case, or even a personal vendetta. It was about something much larger. A fight to expose the hidden truths about the police force, to challenge a broken system, and to ensure that the voices of the oppressed were heard. He wasn't just fighting for Lisa's justice anymore. He was fighting for a future where people like her, people like him, would never have to experience such a blatant abuse of power again. But as much as the struggle had taken from him, it had given him something as well, a deeper sense of purpose. The constant battles had forced Jordan to reflect on his own values, to realize that justice wasn't something you just hoped for or talked about, it was something you fought for. Every single day, Jordan's transformation wasn't just internal, it had started a ripple effect that was now spreading beyond him. By standing up to Daniels, Jordan had opened a door. He had shown others that it was possible to fight back, that you didn't have to accept the status quo. The internal investigation had revealed systemic corruption, but it was the community's response that had been the true testament to the power of collective action. The broader implications of Jordan's struggle reached far beyond his personal fight with Officer Daniels. His actions had exposed the toxic culture that allowed racism and corruption to fester within law enforcement. It had peeled back the curtain on the systemic biases that had been ingrained in the very foundation of the police department. What began as an isolated incident had now evolved into a national conversation about the abuse of power, racial profiling, and the need for police reform. Jordan had never intended for his fight to become so public. When he first challenged Daniels, all he wanted was for Lisa to receive the justice she deserved. But the more the case grew, the more Jordan realized that this was never just about one officer or one incident, it was about the much larger, deeply entrenched issues that plagued the system. What had happened to Lisa was not an isolated case. It was the rule, not the exception. And it wasn't just the police force. It was the justice system as a whole, one that often failed to protect the most vulnerable, and that turned a blind eye to its own corrupt practices. In the weeks following Daniels' arrest and the public fallout that followed, Jordan had become a beacon for reform. He was not only a symbol of resistance, but also a living reminder that change could happen, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. His journey wasn't just about exposing one man's wrongdoing, it was about showing everyone that change was possible through resilience, persistence, and above all, unity. For the first time, Jordan began to see the cracks in the system as potential points of entry. His fight against Daniels wasn't just about a single victory. It was the start of a larger movement, one that sought to hold every officer, every institution, and every person in power accountable. And though the path ahead was still long and uncertain, Jordan was committed to walking it. But there was still so much left to do, While the department had made some significant changes, initiating new training programs, implementing stronger oversight, and even beginning to enforce stricter policies around racial bias, Jordan knew these were only the first steps. True systemic change would take years, and even then, it could still be met with resistance from those who benefited from the system as it was. The road to reform would be slow, but it would be relentless. Jordan's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of a knock at the door. He turned to find Lisa standing in the doorway, a tired but hopeful expression on her face. "You did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Jordan smiled, though the weight of everything that had happened still lingered in his eyes. "We did it together." Lisa stepped into the room, standing beside him and looking out at the city below. "It feels like it's just the beginning, doesn't it?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "We've done something important, but it's not over yet." Jordan nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "No, it's not. There's still a lot of work to do, but this is a step, a big one." As Jordan and Lisa continued their work, the momentum didn't slow. The community remained behind them, offering their support and demanding more from the police department. Activist groups grew stronger, working with local leaders to push for greater accountability and transparency. With Jordan's leadership, the cause had become a movement, one that no longer just represented one man's fight against corruption, but a collective battle for justice and equality. And in this movement, every voice mattered. Every story shared, every person who stood up against the system, brought them closer to their goal. Jordan understood this more deeply than anyone. His actions, his struggle, had inspired thousands, if not millions, to demand a better future. A future where their voices could no longer be ignored. Though the battle would continue for years, Jordan could finally see a path forward. He no longer felt like an outsider, fighting against a machine he could never beat. He knew, with certainty, that systemic change was not only possible, it was inevitable. But it would take all of them, working together, to make it happen. As Jordan sat back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edges of the city skyline, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He had changed, yes, but so had the world around him. The cracks in the system that had once felt too big to cross had been bridged by people like him, people who refused to accept things as they were. And though there was more work to do, Jordan finally felt as though he had found his true calling, to fight for justice, not just for himself or for the ones he loved, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, mistreated, or silenced. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments when the battle seemed too much to bear. But Jordan knew one thing for certain. With persistence, courage, and the unwavering support of the community, anything was possible. His journey was far from over, and as he looked ahead, he knew that the fight for justice would always be worth it.